I think it's fair to say Paul's got a pretty unusual title. It's not the sort of thing that you'll find at every consultancy in the UK, but that really does reflect the way that we think here at Redington. We believe that good governance and good decision making are absolutely critical. It's as important as all of the inputs, the asset liability modelling, the financial assumptions that go into the decisions you make. Good governance, good decision making has a tangible impact on your scheme outcomes. So with no further ado, I will pass over to Paul.
So to move us towards the 6 hardest words, I'd like to start with a quick thought experiment. I'd like you to imagine an investment committee meeting. And this is an important one. You've got to discuss and make a decision on a really complex financial strategy, and it's a decision that you're going to have to be actively involved in. Your consultant starts the presentation. You've worked with her for years. She's a brilliant communicator. But today, by the time you get to page 2 of the presentation, it's getting difficult. By the time you get to page 5, you're absolutely lost. And as we all do in this type of scenario, you look up and look around and see what's going on in the room. And you notice that the chair and everyone else is nodding sagely as the consultant speaks. Now, for most of us in this type of scenario, there are going to be 2 equally loud voices screaming in our heads. One is going to be saying something like, "Stop, for God's sake, tell her to stop, that you don't understand, to go back." But there's going to be another voice as well, and it's going to be saying something like, "No, just nod, look like everyone else, we can fudge this at the end." And the interesting question is, which voice wins? Now, a decent amount of that is going to be about us, our life experience, our personalities, but a really important point is the culture of the boards that we work in, more specifically their level of psychological safety. And today we're going to try and do 2 things. 1, look at what psychological safety is. 2, why it's important from a decision-making perspective. And 3, look at some really practical takeaways that you can use from your very next meeting to make things better. Now, if you haven't heard the term psychological safety before, it isn't something that Redington have invented. It's something that's been studied by academics and industry for several years. For example, a couple of years ago, Google did a really big research project trying to figure out what drove the success of its most effective teams. And their key conclusion was that the most important factor was teams having a high level of psychological safety. Now, Google defined it in a way that I think we'd agree with. It's about the ability to be vulnerable and to take risks in front of your colleagues, to not look stupid when you suggest something. And hopefully all of us have had at least one experience of working in a team like that in our professional lives. And when you work in that kind of team, all kinds of brilliant things can happen. You can get difficult issues on the table without fear. You can sort them out. You can hear really diverse perspectives and fold them into your decision making. But perhaps most importantly, you can say the 6 hardest words, which I believe are, "I don't know, and I was wrong." And when you can't say those words, you're opening yourself up to all kinds of problems. You're looking at having groupthink, you're looking at kicking really important decisions into the long grass and making bad choices and sticking with them. But perhaps most importantly for all of us as decision makers, we need to keep on learning about things that are happening in the market. If we can't say what we don't know, or if we can't learn from our mistakes, then we're going to end up in all kinds of problems. So I guess the key question is, why do we find it so hard to say those words? And there's a really simple and powerful reason, and it's because we're human, but more specifically, humans who've been shaped by evolution. Now, over the last several 100,000 years, evolution has shaped both our bodies and the way that we think. And the key point is that from an evolutionary perspective, lots of the things that worked for us a couple of 100,000 years ago cause all kinds of problems for us now. We only have to look about how nature shaped our palates. It makes us enjoy sweet and fatty foods. And because we grew up in an unstable food environment, when we find those kind of things, eat lots of them. That worked incredibly well as a strategy on the savannah, but when we have a Sainsbury's on every corner, it's terrible. It's not only true of our bodies. Evolution has shaped a whole bunch of drives for us as humans. And today we're going to look at 2 of them. It's the drive to conform and the drive for relative status. Now, before I offend anybody here, there's a couple of key points that I need to make about drives. And the first is that almost all of them happen below the level of conscious thought. This is not our personalities driving them, it's hardware that's built in. The second point is that the way that drives work, they manifest themselves in different ways, in different people, and for us individually, in different ways at different points in time. I'm very different now, coming up to 50, than I was when I was 30. But biologists make a very clear case that these drives exist. So let's look at the first one, the drive for relative status. Now, from an evolutionary perspective, relative status, where we stood in a group, was really important. It dictated our access to resources, i.e. food, and our ability to choose mates. And arguably, those things are still kind of important today. But a really interesting fact that researchers have found is that we just hate to admit that those things might be the case. Very few of us are happy putting our hands up and saying, I'm a fully paid up member of the Keeping Up with the Jones Society. So the interesting question is, does this exist or not? Well, let's look at a thought experiment that a lot of researchers do. All of us in this room have been working for quite a long time, and it's probably fair to say that we all enjoy praise from our leaders. So I'm going to offer you a choice of living in one or two worlds. We can live in world one, where 3 times a year you get praised publicly by your boss, and all of your colleagues get praised once rather. Or I can offer you another choice. You can live in a world where you get significantly more praise, significantly more good feelings. However, there's a catch on this, which you can't see. Let me show you the catch. In this second world, you're getting more praise, but everyone else is getting praise significantly more than you. It's an interesting question, right? I'm not going to pick on anyone and say, what is your particular choice? But the really interesting thing is that when researchers look at this, and they've done this across a whole range of domains, money, attractiveness, the intelligence of our children, pretty much, or not pretty much everyone, a large proportion of people choose to have less in an absolute sense and more than everyone else. So how might this play out in our boards? What drives status in the work and trustee environment? I'm sorry, I don't think there's anything practically we can do this. I think it's going to just keep on doing it. Well, I'd argue in our knowledge-based economy, it's really driven by what we know and how we deal with things. Do we have a ready answer for problems? If someone tosses us a difficult question, can we come up with an answer straight away? And I guess the key point is here that that just makes things very difficult when you're in a pension environment. But if that wasn't a big enough problem, then relative status has an evil twin, and that's conformity. Now again, from an evolutionary perspective, we evolved as pack animals. It was incredibly important for us to work in a highly coordinated way. And to make that work, nature has given us some very fine-tuned radar. When we're not in line with the crowd, everything feels uneasy. When we're in line with the crowd, things feel right. Now, as most of you are aware, there's been a very large body of behavioural research done over the last 50 years ago, but before we had that, we had something just as potent and frankly funnier, and that was candid camera.
The gentleman in the elevator now is a candid star. These folks who are entering, the man with a white shirt, the lady with a trench coat, and subsequently one other member of our staff, will face the rear. And you'll see how this man in the trench coat tries to maintain his individuality, but little by little, he looks at his watch, but he's really making an excuse for turning just a little bit more.
We've all been there. We feel his pain. I guess that's conformity in the context of a lift. But how might that play out in our decision-making boards? Well, I think in a couple of ways. The first one is following the herd. That's what conformity is essentially driving us towards doing. Now, if we think back to that first thought experiment that we did, if you're the only person who doesn't understand what's going on, then following the herd is actually quite a sensible strategy. The reality is, in modern pension management, it's so complex that it's highly unlikely that a lot of people around the table won't know what's going on. So simply following the herd is a really bad strategy. And as importantly, not feeling that you can challenge. you're going to hear later on about the importance of diverse perspectives, but if you or one of your colleagues has a view that they really want to get onto the table and no one else is prepared to hear it, then we're unlikely to get the value of it. It's why we need psychological safety. So that brings us quite neatly on to our 7 top tips for making that happen. I think the first point is just starting the discussion. If you found this interesting or relevant, we'd be really happy to come along and do a half-an-hour session over lunch at one of your meetings. If you haven't got time to do that, then you can circulate a paper that we'll be giving to you in a couple of weeks' time that will summarise all of this work and the feedback that you provide from this session. The second point, and this is a longer-term cultural issue, it's reframing the game. In our work environment, in some ways it's kind of natural to fear saying that you don't know. If you're the HR director of a company and you consistently can't answer your CEO when they ask you, how many people do we have, what's our turnover, you're unlikely to be the HR director of that company for quite long. But the massively important point is, in our investment boards, very few of us are expert. It should be the norm to say that I don't know, rather than feeling that I have to say that I do. The third point is naming, not shaming. It's incredibly powerful to think about some of these issues as just fundamental design flaws, as us as humans. For me, I've been looking at this for a very long time. It was an absolutely massive weight off my shoulders when I realised it wasn't a character flaw in me seeing this. It's something that applies to absolutely everybody. If you can create that sense of shared responsibility, it makes life a bit easier. Number 4, this is a crucially important practical one. As chairs or experienced trustees, if you can feel that you can't say I don't know, then no one else on the board will find that easy to do either. Some of the chairs that we work with, we know play deliberately slow. We know they understand stuff, but they will actually pretend that they don't to make it easier for the rest of their team to raise issues. Number 5, take it outside. We spend an awful lot of time working with you on education, trying to sort of help you understand key concepts so that you can take good decisions. Most of the time we do that in a group context and people still struggle to get things. What we'd be very happy to do, particularly if you have new stakeholders on board, is if people need some private one-on-one time to really understand issues and want to feel they can ask stupid questions, speak to your consultant. They will do that for you. Number 6, short-circuit the system. Particularly in the context of conformity, we can break some of those barriers really easily by just changing the systems that we use to take votes or how we make decisions. At the back of the room, you'll see a paper that will show you how to do that. Number 7, and this is really about us, making things work. We see ourselves as strategic partners to you. We spend an awful lot of time making sure that we can try and communicate things easily. If we're not doing that well, for whatever reason, please tell us. We will double down on our efforts to try and make things work for you. I've done that very briefly, so we have plenty of time for questions, and so with that, I'll pass over to Zoe. Thank you.
Plenty of time. I think we've literally got 5 minutes, but I'd love to open this now to you for you to share perhaps some of the experiences you have on your boards around psychological safety. Do you regularly hear those words? I don't know. I don't understand. What are perhaps some of the hurdles that you've faced in terms of trying to achieve that, or indeed if you've got any questions on any of the content that Paul's just delivered.
As an MNT, somebody helped me to frame this if I need to explain this to a member, have I got this right? It's sort of way which gives you the permission to say, it's not I don't understand, I just don't know if I can explain it again. Which was a useful get out feeling under pressure.
That's a really perfect example of what we're looking for, trying to benefit from the wisdom of the crowd here. So thank you for that.
One of the things I find is not recognising I don't know.
Yeah.
It's whether it's important.
Yeah.
So, using the example of, say, an investment board, and you've got a new investment manager coming in pitching his new product to you with his 60-page deck.
Yeah.
There's probably 40 pages in that you don't understand, and it's probably not important. It's filtering that whether it's important to say I don't know, can you elaborate further so we can understand, as opposed to saying it probably on every page of the deck.
That's a really good point.
Yeah, very challenging. But I think the sort of feeling that you're able to actually even just perhaps ask the question, like, I'm not really with you, is this something crucial to us moving on and getting through this? Or is it something we can bypass? It's just having that sense of being able to express that vulnerability, I think.
And that's something that you should look to your consultant to sort of point out and move them along. And I think any of you who've been Redington clients for any period of time will know the singular focus that we try and bring to getting you to the most important decisions. That should hopefully happen with the manager thing as well. Again, if we're not doing that well enough for you, just tell us. Don't be embarrassed. We won't be offended. As I say, we'll just double down on our efforts to make it better next time. So a question that might be pertinent for you, that came from the previous group, is which are the most important things there, if you had to take one thing away? And I think there's one cultural point and one very practical thing straight away. So if you're looking for a really practical thing that you can do straight away, it's point 4. It's totally within the gift of the chair and the senior trustees to actually start asking those questions and creating that habit amongst anything else. It doesn't cost anything, you can do it straight away. The longer term thing is just really getting it properly on the table. Often when we discuss these things, then it can lead to a really wide and open discussion. We know that everyone here has very crowded schedules. The easiest way, as I said at the start, is probably to do this is do this over lunch while you're eating sandwiches. It can make it a little bit more entertaining than maybe discussing some of the other stuff. We'd be very happy to facilitate it. We can also, if anyone wants it, share some very good, easy books on this that we've used that have made a really powerful way to create common language within our business.
Any more questions or any thoughts or observations? Anyone from the Redington team?
If someone was sceptical about the idea of psychological safety, it wasn't something that they'd come across, and you were introducing it and they were scoffing, how would you change their opinion and try and...
lift.
Yeah.
If someone is dismissive, is there any...
I think the really interesting thing is when you see companies that are so nakedly driven as Google, spending a huge amount of time trying to change how they operate in that way, that kind of tells you it's actually something that's important. It's not I'm conscious of the fact you probably just come out of a session on mindfulness and maybe thinking slightly differently about this, but this is really, commercial firms take this seriously because they see the value in enhanced decision making. So there's some very good stuff that we can point to towards that.
Is it a quick one, Robin?
Coming back to your point, what is the most important, or maybe not the most important, but the most urgent point in there? Coming back to the evolution. So we spent a number of years being in a pack because it assured us safety and food and etc. Very often that pack was led by someone, and if the leader was incompetent, the pack would not benefit and then would die probably. Based on personal experience, I would say that maybe the most urgent, probably for the corporate sponsor, is the role of the chair.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, if the leader is incompetent, if the leader closes the door to all these good things, it's very difficult for the rest of the trustees to act on it. And so to some extent, it would be great to have representatives of corporate sponsors going through this session, because often it is a corporate sponsor who has the final word on who will be the chair.
For those of you who haven't met him, this is Robin Claessens, who's one of the MDs in the firm and one of our lead investment consultants. On this concept of the chair, it is massively important. Do try and make some time to speak to Robin later on and ask him about the research that he published recently on the impacts of good and bad chairs. It was a really great piece of research and touches on some really implementable points. But I think we're now done for that. We are. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen.